I see I have been too easy on you. I have made you into my pets, yeah. That is what they call you, you know.
In 1939, Heinrich Himmler promoted the construction of an unprecedented concentration camp. It was Ravensbrück, the only one conceived exclusively for women. Tens of thousands of female prisoners from across Europe were deported there. Among them were political resistors from France, Poland and Spain, Jewish women from the ghettos, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses, and Roma women persecuted by the regime. From their arrival, they were stripped of their identity, humiliated during searches, and forced into labor that pushed them to the limits of their lives. The camp quickly became a laboratory of horror. In its barracks, young Polish prisoners were subjected to medical experiments that left indelible scars, while others endured extreme punishments, planned starvation and endless workdays in armament factories. With the collapse of the Third Reich, the camp entered an even more sinister phase. Thousands of women were sent on death marches or transported to erase any trace of what had happened. This documentary reveals the history of Ravensbrück and the chilling truths that emerged after its liberation. The hidden origins of the Ravensbrück camp. To understand how what happened in 1939 was possible, we must go back a few years. Since 1934, the SS had been discreetly acquiring land on the shores of Lake Schwetzee, north of Berlin. On that shore stood the modest village of Ravensbrück, soon surrounded by SS properties. Between 1936 and 1938, the purchases expanded to cover hundreds of hectares, ensuring both control of the area and the future construction of facilities. The site had ideal conditions: natural isolation, direct railway connection to Berlin and Oranienburg, and lake access for transporting materials. In November of that same year, 500 prisoners from Sachsenhausen, along with a female detachment from Lichtenberg, were forced to build the facilities. On a plot of just over 1 kilometer by 3, they began to outline the perimeter, barracks, and initial fences. The choice was not random. Besides the isolation, the river system allowed the camp to be supplied with coal and materials via barges, and the natural surroundings offered an attractive landscape for officers to settle with their families. Oswald Pohl, head of the SS economic empire, was one of the first to move to a nearby estate. With the construction well underway, the initial garrison consisted of about 30 female guards and a dozen male SS members under the command of Max Kogel, an officer trained at Dachau. However, the most influential figure was Johanna Langefeld, tasked with enforcing discipline among the inmates and representing a new form of female control in the camps. The creation of Ravensbrück was also part of a broader process. Since 1933, concentration camps had become the main tool of repression against communists, social democrats, and trade unionists. Himmler had made Dachau the model for this network, with Theodor Eicke as the architect of its regulations: absolute obedience, depersonalization, and planned violence. From there emerged figures like Rudolf Höss, the future commander of Auschwitz, and Kogel himself. It was the so-called Dachau School, where brutality was taught as a method. For female opponents, prisons and reformatories initially sufficed. The Moringen camp in Lower Saxony housed communists, socialists, and trade unionists in conditions that seemed less harsh. There were no locks on the doors, and some guards ran errands for them. However, the reality was equally devastating. Many knew their husbands had been executed and their children handed over to regime-friendly families. Jehovah's Witnesses, persecuted for refusing to swear loyalty to Hitler, and women accused of racial dishonor for relationships with Jews, soon joined this group. Over time, the repression intensified. In 1936, Olga Benario's fate made this clear. A German communist handed over by Brazil to the Gestapo, she gave birth in prison, was separated from her daughter, and was eventually deported to Ravensbrück, where she died in a gas chamber. Cases like hers showed that the reach of Nazi terror extended beyond Germany, crossing borders. 2 years later, in 1938, the mass arrests of the Action Arbeitsscheu Reich led to the detention of thousands of women accused of prostitution, begging, or vagrancy. With them, the asocial category further expanded the scope of persecution and gave Himmler the opportunity to solidify his project. It was no longer just about suppressing dissent. The goal was to shape society according to ideological criteria. In this context, the need for a large women's camp to replace Moringen and Lichtenberg became evident. The answer was Ravensbrück. Meanwhile, the preparations did not go unnoticed by the local population. Neighbours saw barges arriving with materials and prisoners in striped uniforms, felling trees on the northern shore of the lake. The project advanced under official discretion that no one dared to question, though its purpose was evident. In parallel, Fürstenberg became increasingly integrated into the Nazi machinery. During Kristallnacht, its Jewish cemetery was destroyed and Jewish properties passed into new hands. Far from sparking rejection, the camp's construction generated enthusiasm among some residents who saw it as a source of employment. Even several women volunteered as guards, encouraged by propaganda that presented the work as a service to the Reich. In the spring of 1939, Ravensbruck opened its doors. On May 15th, blue buses transferred the first prisoners from Lichtenberg, many of them carrying letters or photographs as their only keepsakes. What they found upon arrival was not the calm of the landscape, but the shouts of the guards and the barking of dogs, an immediate warning that violence began even before crossing the gate. Ravensbrück in 1939, war reaches the camp's gates. The closing of the gates marked the definitive entry into the camp's system. As soon as they stepped off the trucks, the prisoners were led in a line to a building near the entrance. There, the stripping began. Their belongings were placed in numbered sacks, their hair was shaved, and their bodies were reduced to numbers in a register. The process not only took away personal items, but transformed each woman into another cog in a control machine. Among them, Jewish women soon began to arrive, whose marginalization did not originate with Nazism, but had roots in centuries past. In medieval Europe, they had been excluded from many trades and forced to live in segregated neighborhoods, the so-called Judenviertel. With the Third Reich, this legacy of exclusion reached a new dimension. After Kristallnacht, most Jewish men were arrested, while women were initially sidelined. However, some were first interned in Lichtenberg and later in Ravensbrück from its opening in 1939. Many came from middle-class families and small, close-knit communities that could never have imagined the fate awaiting them. Once registered, they received the clothing that would accompany them henceforth: a striped dress, a jacket, a white headscarf, and wooden clogs. Coloured triangles sewn onto the fabric classified their status within the camp: red for political prisoners, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, green for common criminals, black for those deemed asocial, and yellow for Jewish women. Sometimes the patches were combined, signalling multiple reasons for persecution. For Jewish women, the impact was even more devastating: separation from their families, the public humiliation of being paraded naked, hair shaving, and the obligation to perform heavy labor, such as building roads or moving materials, were experienced with a particular degree of trauma. The guards, far from ignoring their physical limitations, seemed to take pleasure in ridiculing them when they failed to complete these tasks. It is no surprise that some, officially registered as political prisoners, tried to hide their Jewish origins to avoid additional punishments. With this initial depersonalization, the daily routine in the barracks began. Each woman was given a narrow cot, a minimal shelf, and an aluminum plate, all under strict rules. Blankets had to be folded precisely, metal kept clean, and the space orderly. The Oberaufseherin, Johanna Langefeld, the highest authority in Ravensbrück, imposed a regime that combined bureaucracy with rigid discipline. The slightest oversight could lead to sanctions that ensured constant obedience. This system was reinforced by the Appell, the morning roll call. At 5 in the morning, the prisoners were lined up along the edge of the Schwetzi and stood motionless for hours in the cold. Emma Zimmer, Langefeld's assistant, oversaw the formation with blows and insults. After the roll call, they received a meagre breakfast of watery coffee and stale bread before being sent to work details. Some, like the Austrian communist Hannah Sturm, were assigned to workshops. Most had to dig trenches or haul loads in the sandgrube, where bloodied feet inside clogs barely endured the workday. Those who could not withstand these demands or committed infractions were taken to the Strafblock, the punishment block. Isolated behind barbed wire, prisoners endured endless labor, icy showers, or straitjackets. The case of Marianne Wuchstein, taken there under the promise of medical care and then locked in solitary confinement for weeks, served as a warning of what it meant to defy the camp's discipline. While this happened to the prisoners, the lives of the guards presented a stark contrast. Many were widows or divorcees who had taken the job for economic stability. They lived in new houses by the lake, sent postcards boasting about their work, and posed for photos with their dogs. Just a few meters away, the camp's violence continued, but in their homes, an image of domestic normalcy prevailed. Within the barracks, immediate authority fell to the blokovers. Prisoners turned into auxiliaries of power. Some adopted the guards' violence, while others tried to ease tensions, facilitating small acts of help. Thanks to them, discreet messages and news from the outside circulated, and it was even possible to share fragments of books, recited quietly during breaks. With the summer, the regime's harshness intensified in step with Germany's war preparations. Propaganda fueled hatred against Slavic peoples, and the guards echoed these slogans when speaking of husbands and sons sent to the front. Military inspections multiplied, and Langenfeld forced the prisoners to stand for hours under the sun to display discipline before Luftwaffe officers. Suspicion of conspiracies grew, and the Strafblock reached its capacity limit. Within Ravensbrück, the atmosphere reflected the same climate that dominated the entire Reich. Increased surveillance, more forced labor, and constant fear. Outside, Germany was finalizing its attack on Poland. Meanwhile, inside, the camp was also preparing for the war about to begin. Ravensbrück under Himmler, the revenge for Reinhard Heydrich. The outbreak of the war further hardened life in Ravensbrück. Surveillance intensified, and repression reached new heights. Just a few months later, in January of 1940, Heinrich Himmler personally visited the camp. While Hitler never showed interest in touring such places, his Reichsführer SS considered them the foundation of his power, and each inspection was an opportunity to reaffirm his authority. Upon his arrival, Commander Kogel and Johanna Langenfeld awaited him. Himmler toured the grounds amid scenes of extreme exhaustion. Pale women, some barely able to stand, were forced to shovel snow or break the ice on the lake. The contrast between the discipline imposed by the officers and the fragility of the prisoners could not have been starker. During that visit, Kogel voiced his main concern: the resistance of the Jehovah's Witnesses. These women refused to sew military sacks, a defiance that neither hunger, beatings, nor confinement had managed to break. Intrigued, Himmler wanted to see them. He was led to the damp cells of the bunker, where 9 prisoners were praying silently. He warned them that their God had abandoned them, but one responded firmly, "Our God will save us. And if he doesn't, we still won't serve yours." Their unshakable faith irritated the Reichsführer, though he refused to order the punishment Kogel requested. Instead, he decided to release them from the bunker and send them to forced labor or as servants in SS households. The inspection also revealed another urgent issue: overcrowding. Deportations from Poland were filling the barracks to their limits. The Jewish bloc was saturated, and the hospital could barely tend to women ravaged by malnutrition and sores. For Kogel, they were mere nuisances. For Himmler, they were useless mouths, whose elimination was already planned. In parallel, during those same months, the secret euthanasia policy known as the T4 program had begun, named after the Reich Chancellery's address at Tiergartenstrasse 4. Patients with disabilities were selected by doctors, transported in disguised buses, and murdered in centers masquerading as hospitals. Families received false letters notifying them of sudden deaths. The chosen method, carbon monoxide gas in sealed chambers, was first tested in Austria and later expanded to Germany. For Himmler, this system proved that the mass elimination of those the regime deemed unworthy of life was feasible. Ravensbrück would soon be integrated into this logic. There were also grotesque episodes. During that same visit, Himmler listened enthusiastically to Oswald Pohl, head of the SS Economic Office, discuss chicken breeding and animal breed selection. Convinced that poultry genetics could serve as a model for human purity, the Reichsführer paid more attention to these musings than to Langefeld's objections about the brutality of the punishments. In this trivial context, he finally authorized the floggings Kogel had demanded, a bureaucratic detail that, for the prisoners, institutionalized daily suffering. From then on, the camp transformed at an even faster pace. In May of 1942, the Czech resistance managed to carry out an assassination attempt in Prague against Reinhard Heydrich, one of the Reich's most powerful leaders. Severely wounded, he survived a few days before dying of infection. Hitler and Himmler sought culprits, and the blame fell on surgeon Karl Gebhardt, accused of failing to use the new sulfonamide drugs. Discredited, Gebhardt needed to prove his scientific competence, and the concentration camps offered the perfect opportunity. The revenge for Heydrich was not limited to science. As retaliation, the small village of Lidis was erased from the map. Men were shot, children were separated from their families, and women were deported to Ravensbrück. They arrived confused, carrying bundles with the little they had managed to save. One of them gave birth in the camp's hospital. The newborn was killed hours later, and the mother was brutally beaten. That scene became etched in the collective memory as a symbol of Nazi ferocity following Heydrich's death. Simultaneously, Gebhardt organized his experiments. While they had previously been tested on male prisoners, now young, healthy women were chosen, under the pretext that their sentences made their sacrifice useful. Himmler personally selected a group of Polish women from the Lublin transport, convinced they were the most suitable. This decision marked the beginning of a new phase in Ravensbrück, its transformation from a punishment camp to a human laboratory. In the summer of 1942, the first operations began. The hospital was equipped with surgical materials from Hohenleichen, the sanatorium directed by Gebhardt. Among those selected were teenagers, barely over 16 years old. The procedures involved making deep incisions in their legs to introduce bacteria, wood splinters, and glass fragments. The goal was to induce infections and test whether antibiotics could stop them. On July 22nd, 75 young Polish women were lined up in the central square: Kogel, Gebhardt, his assistant Fritz Fischer, and Dr. Hertha Oberhäuser, accompanied by the camp's doctors, appeared. The women were ordered to lift their skirts to have their legs examined, amid mockery and derogatory comments. They did not know what was being prepared. Some thought it was a work assignment. Others feared execution. A few days later, 10 were separated and taken to the hospital. Among them was Wanda Wojtasik, torn from her inseparable friend Krysia. That night, they received clean beds and unusually courteous treatment, which heightened their uncertainty. After being injected, they fell into a forced stupor and awoke with their legs in casts, marked with codes written in ink. Soon, the suffering became evident. Intense fevers, unbearable pain, wounds oozing dark fluids, and a stench that attracted flies. Some managed to see the fragments removed from their bodies and realized that the infections had been deliberately induced. In that hostile environment, small gestures of support among prisoners became the only refuge. A hidden piece of bread, a message on the wall, a word of encouragement. These were signs of humanity in the face of a calculated process to reduce them to mere objects of observation. Meanwhile, SS doctors discussed the lack of conclusive results. In post-war trials, Gebhardt and Fischer claimed that the initial infections were too mild to measure the drug's effectiveness. Ernst Grawitz, chief SS doctor and president of the German Red Cross, criticized the experiments, comparing them to flea bites. He ordered the conditions to be intensified, even suggesting that prisoners' legs be shot to simulate combat wounds. Although not all agreed to this extreme, subsequent operations were performed with even more aggressive methods, such as cutting off blood circulation or introducing larger amounts of bacteria. The women returned to the barracks barely able to walk. Wanda Wojtasik survived thanks to the help of her friend Krysia and the solidarity of companions like Alfreda Preuss, who shared her bread ration. In September, new prisoners were called to the hospital, among them Stefania Wotoka. There they found the previous ones, bedridden and covered in foul-smelling bandages. Within days, they suffered the same fate. The infections advanced violently, causing fever, unbearable thirst, and pain that left them without strength. Oberhäuser's indifference as she recorded symptoms without showing compassion deepened the sense of abandonment. It wasn't long before the first fatality appeared, Weronika Kraska, who succumbed to what seemed to be tetanus. Her screams echoed through the hospital before she died after a lethal injection. The news spread through the barracks like a whispered warning. The next could be anyone. At the same time, Himmler showed interest in new experiments linked to the front. The war in the East and the Atlantic posed the problem of soldiers exposed to extreme temperatures. Convinced that medicine could replicate traditional remedies, he tasked Dr. Sigmund Rascher with resuscitation tests on prisoners in Dachau. Some Ravensbrück prisoners previously sent to camp brothels with promises of freedom were used in these tests as instruments of human warmth. It was another form of slavery disguised as research. In those same months, a new figure arrived, Ludwig Stumpfegger, a young surgeon close to Himmler and a former collaborator of Gebhardt. The first victim was Basia Petrzik, just 16 years old, known for her lively spirit. During the operation, Stumpfegger extracted bone fragments from her legs for study in Hohenleichen. From that moment, the Ravensbrück hospital ceased to be a place of rudimentary care and became a space for planned mutilations. Induced fractures, failed grafts, and muscle removals were repeated time and again. Under Oberhäuser's coldness, Fischer's rigidity, and Stumpfegger's zeal, the Revier transformed into a true laboratory of pain. By November 1942, the prisoners realized they were no longer isolated cases, but pieces in a systematic machine serving Nazi science. This shift was not accidental. Gebhardt's ambition and Himmler's direct support turned Ravensbrück into an experimental stage with strategic value for the SS. There, Polish prisoners were subjected to a new logic, serving as human material for a science subordinated to the regime's ideology. The young women would be remembered as the guinea pigs of Ravensbrück, involuntary witnesses to how the logic of extermination could also take the form of scientific research. What began with incisions in a few legs would turn into a chain of even crueler operations, a prelude to the camp's darkest chapters. Eicke and the creation of a disciplinary model for Nazism. The disciplinary system governing Ravensbrück did not emerge from nothing. It was based on a model already tested in other camps. Since the 1930s, Theodor Eicke had designed a rigid regulation in Dachau that, under the guise of a legal code, aimed to enforce absolute obedience. Its provisions were presented as a guarantee of order, with the promise that those who followed the rules would avoid sanctions. However, behind this facade lay a far more brutal practice, as Eicke had trained guards to act with coldness and without compassion toward those deemed enemies of the state. Thus, the written rules served as a mask to legitimize arbitrariness and violence. In Ravensbrück, prisoners were subjected to an initial quarantine with strict and often contradictory rules. The language barrier made it impossible to fully understand them, and the sheer number of regulations made compliance unattainable. Any oversight could be considered a violation, leading to severe punishments and fostering a constant climate of insecurity. The most common punishment was Strafstehen, which forced prisoners to stand still and silent for hours or even days. It was often applied collectively, adding an element of humiliation. Hunger, exhaustion, and cold intensified the suffering, and in winter it was not uncommon for prisoners to be forced to endure it barefoot. The deprivation of food, suspension of correspondence, or confinement in barracks were also applied as so-called minor punishments. However, these measures were often directed at entire blocks, so that solidarity was undermined by suspicion and resentment. This happened when a group of young Polish women protested against being sent to a brothel. Their bravery resulted in a collective punishment that included the confiscation of packages and a ban on receiving news from their families. Discipline, rather than fostering obedience, sowed internal tensions and divided the prisoners, turning coexistence into a space of constant surveillance. The psychological pressure generated by collective punishments was countered by even more extreme measures designed to crush any hint of resistance. Among them was confinement in the so-called Mad Women's Room, a small space within the sanitary sector where women deemed problematic or mentally unstable were sent. The room measured barely a few meters and could hold 40 or more inmates crammed together, without beds and with few blankets shared among them. Some were naked, others wore rags, and in that suffocating environment, the line between sanity and madness quickly blurred. Those sent there as punishment found themselves surrounded by screams, hysterical laughter, or silences broken by the cries of children. Filth covered bodies and walls, and the stench permeated everything. The inmates' food rations were reduced, so that within a few days many died of exhaustion or ended up as disturbed as the rest. For most prisoners, the mere rumor of being sent to that place was enough to instill a terror that left an indelible mark. If that room represented a descent into absolute dehumanization, the punishment block, known as the Strafblock, was the most feared center in all of Ravensbrück. Separated by barbed wire, it functioned as a small, isolated universe within the camp. Women accused of serious infractions, such as theft or disobedience, were sent there, as were those who accumulated minor offenses or aroused the suspicion of the Gestapo. No correspondence was allowed, the days were reduced to the harshest outdoor labor, and there was no possibility of rest. Among their tasks was cleaning the excrement pits, which required wading knee-deep into them and emptying them with buckets. This type of work not only destroyed physical health but was intended to degrade every last vestige of dignity. Life within the block added another layer of suffering. Many of the inmates belonged to categories labeled asocial or criminal, women hardened by years of confinement who vented their frustration on the weaker, or those who showed greater intelligence. For many, the days in that environment offered a grim view of human nature, where brutality became the rule of survival. Yet, even in that hostile space, contradictory situations emerged, where abuse, corruption and forced relationships intertwined with the power dynamics that defined daily life in Ravensbrück. In the punishment block, violence and degradation were intertwined with an even more definitive threat: execution. The camp's disciplinary system included the death penalty for offenses such as sabotage, escape attempts, or alleged conspiracies. From January 1943, SS orders mandated that the deaths of prisoners be carried out with the utmost discretion. Unlike in men's camps, where brutality was openly displayed in Ravensbrück, these practices were concealed from most eyes. There is scarcely any record of direct witnesses, and the little information available comes from chance circumstances or later testimonies. Most executions were carried out by shooting, often in a corridor adjacent to the crematorium known as the firing corridor. Its location was no coincidence. Once the victim was shot, the body could be thrown directly into the oven through a window. On other occasions, executions were carried out in wooded areas nearby, where the silence of the surroundings helped erase any trace. A male prisoner assigned to the crematorium recounted how he had seen 2 women die from a shot to the back of the neck, executed with silenced weapons. For the rest of the inmates, the gunshots sometimes heard beyond the camp walls were merely incomprehensible echoes of a violence that was never explained to them. It is estimated that hundreds met their death this way, some also by hanging. However, the exact number is impossible to determine. Official records were destroyed, and the silence imposed by the perpetrators erased much of the documentary memory. What remains are fragments, such as the scattered names of some victims, or the poetry written by fellow prisoners who turned memory into a form of resistance. At the same time, the guards enjoyed almost unlimited power. Although there was the appearance of a regulation governing their conduct, sanctions for abuses were minimal or non-existent. In other camps, the few punished supervisors received symbolic sentences, even after causing deaths. This tolerance for arbitrariness reflected a system that had stripped any notion of justice of meaning, favoring violence as the norm of operation. In that universe of discipline and punishment, illness became another frontier of suffering. Every morning before the roll call, prisoners who felt unable to work had to request permission from their barrack leader, or later the block nurse, to visit the infirmary. Initial approval was only the first hurdle, as upon arrival they faced long lines, hoping their fever was high enough to justify rest. A thermometer reading above 39 degrees was almost the only guarantee of staying in bed. Below that, the sentence was to return to the day's labor, even in conditions bordering on agony. Examinations were often superficial and tainted by prejudice. Some doctors avoided getting too close to patients and dismissed those they deemed lice-ridden with disdain. National favoritism added to this. Certain medical staff harassed French, Jewish or Russian women, while others, like Jehovah's Witnesses, avoided the infirmary for fear of reprisals. Only the occasional intervention of courageous prisoner nurses managed to sway these decisions, personally accompanying their companions to prevent their return to work. Beyond the SS's control, a small clandestine network emerged to alleviate suffering. Prisoners employed in the SS pharmacy smuggled medicines hidden among dirty sheets returning from the laundry. From outside, some individuals still opposed to the regime risked what they could to send remedies. Even within the camp, inmates prepared simple charcoal tablets for diarrhea or gathered wild herbs to make infusions that provided some strength. These minimal gestures became acts of resistance against dehumanization. However, those admitted to the infirmary rarely found real relief. Conditions were described as deplorable, with accumulated filth and bedding that was almost never changed. As the camp's population grew uncontrollably in 1942, overcrowding turned the infirmary from housing a few dozen patients to hundreds daily. That same year marked a brutal shift. The extermination through work program became the norm, and the medical services role was reduced to a triage system determining who could still produce and who was discarded. What began as supposed care became another tool in the machinery of exploitation and death. In this environment of neglect, contagious diseases found ideal conditions to spread. Typhus appeared in Ravensbruck for the first time in 1942 and spread rapidly. The symptoms were unmistakable: high fever, skin rashes, extreme exhaustion. Transmission came from lice, which carried the microorganism and introduced it into the skin through their feces during bites, a process worsened by constant scratching. With thousands of malnourished women crammed into infested barracks without means to maintain hygiene, the camp became a perfect laboratory for the epidemic. The SS were aware of the problem and organized periodic disinfections. In 1943, they even created the role of block nurse, tasked specifically with eradicating parasites. But this was futile. After a shower, prisoners returned to wearing the same insect-ridden clothing, without soap or minimal sanitation. The same environment that fueled typhus also facilitated the spread of tuberculosis. Both diseases shared symptoms: weight loss, fever, loss of appetite, and diagnoses were superficial. Many inmates were misclassified, though it hardly mattered. SS doctors didn't aim to treat, but to isolate. Special barracks were opened for typhus and tuberculosis patients, soon known as places of certain death. There, women were crammed 3 to a cot, without medical care and with even further reduced rations. Witnesses described the space as an anticipatory morgue. A 17-year-old girl with tuberculosis accepted her fate and only asked to die in her own bed, something she hadn't had since arriving. Among the prisoners, the tuberculosis block earned an eloquent name: the cemetery. Sometimes solidarity managed to defy this fate. Charlotte Müller succeeded in removing 2 political comrades from the typhus block and transferring them to another barrack where they at least had a chance to survive. But by late 1944, those pavilions had become warehouses for human beings deemed useless. In a slave labor camp, every life was measured solely by its capacity to produce, and the sick were left to die to make room for new arrivals. April 30th, 1945. The arrival of the Red Army in Fürstenberg. The saturation of barracks for the sick was not the only challenge brought by 1944. The collapse of the Eastern Front and the Allied invasion from the West triggered an enormous problem for the Nazi regime: what to do with hundreds of thousands of prisoners who had until then been held in occupied territories. The extermination policy intensified, but at the same time the SS apparatus recognized the value of this labor force, especially as Germany faced severe resource shortages. Thus, a dual movement was accelerated, combining mass killings with the transfer of tens of thousands of prisoners to camps within the Reich's borders, where they could be exploited to the limit. Ravensbruck became one of the main destinations for those convoys. Although official records were destroyed before the liberation, later estimates allow us to grasp the scale of the phenomenon. At the beginning of 1944, the camp held just over 17,000 prisoners. By early 1945, the number had risen to more than 45,000. Other estimates placed the figure even above 50,000. The exact difference remains a matter of debate, but all agree that the population of the complex, including its subcamps, far exceeded any planned capacity. The main facility had been designed for no more than 10,000 women, yet by the end of the war, it housed between 25,000 and 40,000. The pace of transports became dizzying. Documents recovered from Polish archives show that in November 1944, more than 50 convoys arrived with some 7,000 new inmates. That same month, after the dismantling of Birkenau's crematoria, hundreds of Jewish women were sent directly from Auschwitz to Ravensbrück. The influx was so overwhelming that even the less precarious blocks became overcrowded, forcing many to sleep on straw-covered floors. The camp administration sought makeshift solutions. In August, a huge military tent was erected between barracks 24 and 26, designated as Block 25. Its temporary nature quickly became permanent. Without electricity, heating, or proper latrines, that space turned into a warehouse of living bodies, where lack of control and desperation made fighting over a bowl of soup a daily occurrence. With the onset of winter, cold and hunger turned the tent into an antechamber of death. A transport of 2,000 women from Auschwitz in December perished almost entirely in those conditions, to the point that prisoner doctors recalled they died like flies. The screams escaping from the tent at night were audible to those sleeping in nearby barracks, but no one could help. The stench and the sight of dozens of bodies dragged out daily seared the memories of survivors. The tent symbolized, perhaps more than any other space in Ravensbrück, the blend of improvisation and brutality with which the Nazi system managed its final stage, marked by military defeat and the multiplication of human suffering. The sanitary collapse and the introduction of the gas chamber did not halt the constant flow of prisoners to Ravensbrück. On the contrary, in the first months of 1945, transports multiplied, overcrowding the camp to impossible limits. The arrival of convoys from various parts of the Reich, without a parallel increase in resources, condemned thousands of women to die of hunger or cold, even without direct SS intervention. However, this very overcrowding began to create cracks in the camp's discipline, as administrative control grew increasingly fragile. The influx of new inmates was so massive that many were not even registered. In makeshift barracks, such as the so-called Auschwitz shed, women without numbers or files were piled together, a situation that enabled some victims of medical experiments to be hidden, protected in solidarity by other prisoners. Meanwhile, certain transfers offered momentary relief, though their outcomes were uncertain. Entire groups were sent to Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen or Dora-Mittelbau, and rumours mixed with the feeling that any destination, however uncertain, could not be worse than staying in Ravensbrück. At the same time, the contradiction was evident. The labour machinery continued to function regularly. Siemens factories and textile workshops maintained surprisingly high production levels despite bombings and power outages, and work even continued on expanding facilities. But within the camp, anarchy grew. Thousands of women remained without assigned tasks, and surveillance visibly weakened. The internal police no longer patrolled the streets, and at night, bands of inmates looted barracks in search of the few possessions each managed to keep. The breakdown was also reflected in personal relationships. Behaviors previously suppressed began to emerge openly, and some guards became involved in these dynamics, using their power to secure favors or privileges. In some subcamps, the situation reached an unusual degree of permissiveness, confirming the loss of authority among those in charge. None of this mitigated the underlying tragedy. Between January and March 1945, the infirmary officially recorded nearly 4,000 deaths, though the actual numbers were far higher. In a scenario marked by Hitler's refusal to end the war, Ravensbrück became a space where death and disorder advanced at the same pace. By early April 1945, both the prisoners and the SS were aware that the end was near. The imminence of defeat generated conflicting rumours. Some claimed the camp would be set ablaze, others that all would be evacuated, and some feared a generalized massacre. Amid the uncertainty, a kind of collective solace emerged among the prisoners, an imaginary countdown of 14 days that fueled hope for freedom, repeated in songs and improvised verses to endure the wait. The arrival of the first Red Cross convoys in the early days of April seemed to confirm that something was changing. After negotiations with the highest echelons of the SS, several hundred French women, along with a small group of other nationalities, were transferred to Switzerland. Shortly afterward, Danish and Norwegian prisoners followed the same path. The aid packages left by those vehicles, though partly appropriated by the SS, brought a glimmer of relief amidst the hardship, and also highlighted that the system of privileges continued to operate even in the camp's final agony. The internal atmosphere began to shift. Some women dared to organize small acts of camaraderie, such as an improvised dance in a barrack, accompanied by an accordion and the murmur of voices and embraces. The closure of the Siemens factories and textile workshops in mid-April heightened this sense of paralysis. There were no longer regular work shifts, and prisoners spent long hours lying down, smoking cigarettes stolen from guards or singing popular songs, as if this stillness heralded the end. The authority of the guards was crumbling. Roll calls were conducted half-heartedly or simply not held, and many guards displayed a surprisingly cordial attitude or took refuge in alcohol while awaiting the outcome. The lack of control reached such a level that the prisoners themselves broke into SS warehouses, taking goods accumulated from years of looting without fear of reprisal. Some lower-ranking guards even distributed Red Cross packages they had previously confiscated. In parallel, Count Folke Bernadotte, president of the Swedish Red Cross, intensified his efforts to secure the evacuation of thousands of women. With Himmler's approval, in a desperate attempt to influence the Allies, the convoys began to multiply. Buses and ambulances crossed roads toward the Danish border, rescuing exhausted and sick women from the camp in an unusual flicker of humanity amid the catastrophe. Rumors about the camp's fate intensified as the fronts drew closer. The possibility of a mass liquidation, as had occurred at Majdanek, was feared even by the rescue teams themselves. In this climate of uncertainty, Commander Suren surprised the Red Cross by showing willingness to cooperate, even suggesting the evacuation of more women than initially planned. The confusion in orders reflected the disintegration of Nazi power. One day, prisoner departures were forbidden, and the next, Himmler authorized new convoys. On April 26, a train of 60 wagons headed north with thousands of inmates, crossing tracks crowded with refugees and retreating troops. Upon reaching the Danish border, many of those women were so weakened that they died shortly after, despite the medical efforts received in Sweden. Inside Ravensbruck, the disintegration was evident. Documents were burned in the crematorium ovens, and prisoners with sensitive information were secretly executed. At the same time, some groups were released without prior notice, as happened with a small contingent of political prisoners who were given bread and identity certificates before being allowed to leave. Stunned, they crossed Fürstenberg in their prisoner uniforms, begging for food from locals who barely understood who they were, until they managed to board trains packed with displaced people. The proximity of the Red Army precipitated the so-called death marches. Despite warnings from the Red Cross, Suren ordered all those capable of walking to abandon the camp toward the northwest. With minimal rations of bread and aid packages, long columns advanced along saturated roads, guarded by sentinels who initially acted with violence, shooting those who fell, but who soon began to desert as well. Each night, under the cover of darkness, some prisoners slipped away into the forests, while other guards changed into civilian clothes to blend in with the crowd of refugees. Chaos marked those days. Starving women collapsed in ditches. Villagers attempting to help them sometimes caused sudden deaths due to excessive food, and entire columns disintegrated amid the stampede. The line between oppressors and victims blurred as the war reached its climax, and the tragedy of Ravensbruck spilled onto Germany's open roads. The marches that began in the last days of April soon turned into a chaotic movement of survivors and refugees. What started as an organized column became a shifting mass of exhausted beings, where guards and prisoners mixed with the crowd heading west. In Malchow, some women managed to stay in half-destroyed facilities, but most pressed on, with no clear direction beyond reaching the Allied lines. By then, many SS members had vanished, dressed as civilians or even posing as prisoners. The road thus became a human stream, where hierarchies barely remained, and each step was marked by uncertainty. In early May, the first groups managed to cross into territories under British or American control. In small towns like Lubz, some survivors encountered American soldiers who received them with expressions of relief and celebration. For those who had endured hunger, fear, and brutality in recent months, that contact was an indescribable release of emotions, though their physical fragility continued to remind them of the long ordeal they had lived through. Meanwhile, on the afternoon of April 30th, the Red Army entered Fürstenberg. Captain Boris Makarov, tasked with securing the area, was unaware of the camp's exact location until a woman led him to it. What he found was a place without water or electricity, where dozens of prisoners died each day. Dr. Antonina Nikiforova, a Soviet survivor and makeshift head of the infirmary, explained the gravity of the situation to him. Before restoring order, Makarov was also tasked with delivering the news of her husband's death to Rosa Thalmann, one of the communist leaders hiding in the region. The arrival of the Soviets brought a painful paradox. Although they were the liberators, many soldiers engaged in looting and the systematic rape of women in Fürstenberg, a pattern of violence repeated across much of occupied Germany. Only after a week, following strict orders from the command, did this practice abruptly stop. At the same time, the army organized hundreds of local residents to clean barracks, bury accumulated bodies, and assist in the makeshift hospital that the camp had become. Around 3,000 prisoners were attended to at that moment, a number that grew daily as those returning from the death marches arrived. Within a few weeks, basic services were restored, and mortality began to decline, though the suffering left by Ravensbruck lingered in every corner of the place. After its liberation, Ravensbruck ceased to be a place of death and became a site of memory. Its history is not explained solely by numbers, but also by the forms of resistance that unfolded there. Under extreme conditions, the prisoners built communities sustained by language, culture, and solidarity, where creativity served as a survival tool. The contrast was stark. While the regime sought to reduce them to worthless beings, they responded with organization and dignity. In that hostile environment, many women took on unimaginable responsibilities outside the camp's walls. The block system granted some real power over the lives of hundreds of fellow prisoners, a power that could lead to abuse but also to protection. Paradoxically, in a place where Nazism denied women any form of authority, Ravensbrück placed them at the center. What sustained many were not grand feats but everyday gestures, stretching meager rations, improvising clothing, tending wounds, offering comfort. The ability to share and forge emotional bonds became a tool as vital as bread or water. Ravensbrück was a scene of extermination and suffering, but also a space where, against all odds, human dignity flourished. Today, its memorial not only commemorates those who perished, but also those who, with quiet courage, proved that even in the heart of absolute horror, the strength of solidarity and the will to live could not be extinguished.